Well, good morning, Crossword, and welcome to another sermon online with us. And this week we are turning back to the book of 1 Samuel, and I hope that you're excited to see the unfolding story as we've been looking at over the last while. And this week is rather a peculiar week, and you'll see why in a little moment as I turn to the passage. It is an interesting passage, it's a difficult passage, there's a lot of things taking place, and so we won't be able to highlight every little detail, all the nuances, all the foreshadows, all the things that are actually really wrapped up in what has happened and what will happen. There's so many little moving parts in it. But I really hope that this morning will get you to think and encourage you as we look at the passage and we really get to reflect on what the Lord's Word has to say to us this morning. But before we begin, I'm going to open in a word of prayer for us, and then we'll take a look at the passage and I'll read it for us. Let's pray. Well, our gracious Heavenly Father, we do thank you that we can take this time, whether it is from the comfort of our homes, or from sharing it with one another, or whether it is via a Zoom service, or whether we are able to meet publicly, Lord, that wherever we are, your word can find us, and we can engage with not only your word, but you, Lord. And we do thank you for the privilege of being able to share and wrestle with your word, especially when your word seems to be so complicated and challenging. So often those are the times where we need to really dig deep and discover the incredible messages that you have for us and share with us through your incredible plan and purpose. So Lord, I pray that this morning as we look at this passage, that it may point us ultimately to you, that it may glorify your name, and that it may leave us in a space and a place of rejoicing in the midst of you, Lord. So we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as I said, this is a challenging passage this morning, and I do hope that you'll bear with me as we read through the passage and as we turn to it and consider some of the details that we can pick up. I'm going to read the whole passage for us. It's 1 Samuel 21, and we are looking all the way to chapter 22, verse 5. And I'm going to read that for us, so let's go. Verse 1. David went to Nob, to Ahimalek the priest. Ahimalek trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelek the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. David asked Ahimelek, 'Don't you have a spear or a sword here?' 'I have brought my sword, I have not brought my sword or any other weapon, because the king's mission was urgent.' The priest replied, 'The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one.' David said, 'There is none like it. Give it to me.' That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sang they sing about in their dances, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish the king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, "Look at the man, he is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Then his brothers and his father's household heard about it. They went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or disconnected gathered around him and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. From there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Would you let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?" So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. But the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Go into the land of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. So there you go. This is the passage that we are looking at this morning, and perhaps you're scratching your head trying to figure out what this is all about. Seems a lot of things are happening, lots of stuff, movement, a lot of strange and odd things taking place. But I hope that as we look at it now this morning, that it will just be brought into focus. And in many ways, on a side, just to keep this as a side note as we look at this passage, this serves as an introduction, and an introduction in one sense to what is to unfold. There is many little details that are going to resurface again. And so this not only marks some conclusions or reintroductions to certain things, but it marks an introduction to some other characters. It marks introductions to what is going to unfold in upcoming events in the book of 1 Samuel. And particularly next week, we will actually highlight one of those events that is going to unfold. And so just keep this in mind, that this is a introduction, so not all of it might necessarily make sense right now. It will, over time, it will begin to make more and more sense as you remember some of the things that are mentioned here, some of the people that are brought into focus here, and it will hopefully inform you and prepare you for why certain things take place. So that's just helpful to have in the back of your mind. As I say, it's too much to try and hold it all together now. And as we are dealing with a book like 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel needs to be read in light of 1 and 2 Samuel as an entire book. It's not simply just one book or one section that you can pull out and understand. It makes more sense as an entire book rather than just these little sections. So hopefully we can focus in on something particular this morning, but keeping in mind that this is part of a bigger story, a bigger overarching story that unfolds, where we are looking at the kingship that God is instituting. And there is so much that unfolds around that. As for just how to navigate maybe your way through this passage, if you're feeling uncertain and a little bit confused about all the things, there are basically, we can look at 4 different sections to this passage this morning. The first section, we look at David as he is in Nob. This is an interesting situation, an interesting place. This is where the priests are. It seems that the tabernacle has been moved here, and something to just keep in mind. So Shiloh seems to have been done away with, and now they are in Nob. How this transpired, we're not entirely sure. We're not given the details. It's on the outskirts of Jerusalem, because at this point Jerusalem's not yet actually Israel's territory. They don't. It hasn't been conquered yet, at least by David, which will only come in 2 Samuel. But here they are in Nob, and the priests are there. And there is, as you have heard, there is consecrated bread. So there is obviously some important things that we're going to pick up on that in a little bit. That's the first section, as David enters Nob, and he is there with the priest. And there's some interesting stuff taking place. The next section is we find him fleeing, and this time he flees to Gath. Gath is is Philistine territory. He enters into the territory of not only Gath as a region or a place, but he actually enters into the courts of the king of Gath. So the king of one of the Philistine territories, and this is peculiar for us, and we'll see why. There's some details in that we want to notice. And then he takes to hiding, and he hides in Adullam. And as he takes refuge there, he's hiding for the sake of his life, perhaps, and a number of other reasons. And then the final place that we find him moving to is Moab, and he doesn't remain there, but it's significant just in the movement of the passage. And then along with each area, each region, each city or place that we find David, we find peculiar traits, things taking place. In Nob, we find that there is a level of conspiring taking place again. So there seems to be something very peculiar unfolding between him and the priest there in Nob, and we will look into a little bit more detail at that. In Gath, he's acting like a madman. So he's gone from conspiring and perhaps being very calculated in his movements to actually seemingly mad, but yet seems to also still remain calculated in why he's doing what he's doing. And then in Adullam, he is in hiding. He is hiding for his life. Once again, probably a very calculated move, but he is hiding for the sake of protecting his life. And then in Moab, he's doing something very interesting. He moves on to Moab for the sake of protecting his family, protecting the people around him that have come to him to seek protection and refuge and support and help. And so this is very fascinating, the progression of not only the places that David goes, but also the progression of how he's acting in each circumstance. So that's just something very interesting to pick up on, but we're going to highlight a few things in each section, and maybe it will just give us some perspective as to what is actually going on in this section. The first thing that we pick up, and this is helpful to just notice, is that David arrives in Nob and he meets someone called Ahimalek. And if you go and do some reading in 1 and 2 Samuel, you find Ahimalek is an interesting character. He's not just another priest, but he is actually traced back to Eli. So he is essentially one of Eli's descendants who the Lord had sworn to wipe out because of their unfaithfulness, because of their corruptness, and because they had desecrated, they had actually destroyed in many ways the sanctity of the tabernacle and of Shiloh and what it was supposed to be. And so Eli's line is supposedly meant to be cut off, and here we find actually still a part of his line. And what do we make of this? He seems to be slightly different to his forefathers, or at least to his father Eli, or perhaps Phinehas. And so we pick up on some of these kind of differences between what his forefathers were like. But something interesting to just note is Ahimelech has a peculiar name, and his introduction is peculiar as well. If you read there, it says, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" So the first question that's asked is, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? That's important. But before we look at that, we find Ahimelech trembling. Is Ahimelech now trembling because he sees David and he knows who David is? Or is he trembling for another reason? And this is perhaps a little bit of conjecture and maybe some ideas that we can throw around. But it is most likely that we find the answer in Ahimelech's name. Ahimelech means to worry. And so Ahimelech, when we are introduced to him, when he sees David, it would read if we had to translate his name as well into English, worry is trembling. So we have this interesting play on words that we have Ahimelech who is he worries, and as David encounters him, we find worry trembling. And why is he trembling? Is worry trembling about something? Well, it could be one of two things. Either he is worried and therefore trembling because he sees David, but it is more likely because there is a snake in the grass. There is someone that is lurking in the background that threatens Ahimelech's very existence. And we'll glance at that in a moment. As we turn to this passage, though, you find in verse 2 that David answers Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on." And just to pause on that, this is confusing because we know that David has fled now from Saul, and as he fled for his life because Saul has been trying to kill David. He is bloodthirsty and set on a mission to kill David. But as David arrives here, he tells Ahimelech something strange. He tells him that he's on a secret mission and he can't tell Ahimelech anything about the mission. We often are confused by this. We're challenged by it. We're not sure how to handle it. Some will argue that this is a lie, and so David is lying. On the other side, some may argue that maybe David's not really lying. He is actually the king, or perhaps he's speaking on behalf of the Lord, that the Lord has sent him on a mission. It depends on which way you look at it. I would want to argue that perhaps David sees the true king as the Lord, and he takes his cue from the Lord. And hopefully we can get to the end to maybe just tie that up a little bit, to see that David perhaps a little bit better than what we would want to give him credit for, but he takes his cue from the Lord God. But at this point, you could perhaps read it the other way, that he is lying, that he is conniving, that he's conspiring, as we've seen him do it before, at least with Jonathan, as he conspires and makes up stories in order to find out what the king or Saul is really up to. But beyond that, we see that David doesn't make it clear as to which king. Is it Saul the king? Is it himself that sent himself on a mission? Is it the Lord God who is king that has sent him on a mission? We aren't told, and he doesn't make that clear. So he is intentionally vague at this point. But it does seem that Ahimelech is not threatened outright by who David is. And so he becomes quite helpful to David. As it unfolds, it says, "As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now, then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual. Whenever I set out, the men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" And so this is important just to notice this. So David asked for food. He asked for bread that is consecrated, even though he is now, the Ahimelech has said that this bread has been taken from the presence of the Lord and replaced with fresh bread. The bread is intended for the priests and not for just anybody. But what is interesting that the question that is asked is Ahimelech finds reason in one sense to give it to David by questioning him, making sure that he is clean. And by doing so, David affirms it and says he is clean. Him and his men have not been in contact, and most likely meaning slept with any woman. And for that reason, they should be clean and able to eat of the bread. This is complicated because it plays on a number of issues when you are considering the fact that he shouldn't actually be eating the bread at all, and a number of other issues, and we'll try and touch on that in a moment as we get to the end of the passage. We'll highlight one or two things there. But as for this, there is a peculiar foreshadowing that is taking place, and this foreshadows a little bit here as to what will take place in 2 Samuel 11, and it's the same phrase that's used speaking about keeping holy during a time of mission for the king. And it's interesting that when David sends Bathsheba's husband into the battlefield, they are to keep themselves holy, to keep themselves clean, at least, from women, from having sex with women. And so as a result, what ends up happening is it foreshadows, in one sense, what David is going to fail in. But it's not made clear, but the very thing that is mentioned here becomes a stumbling block at a later stage for David himself. He sends his men into the battlefield while he himself is making use of that very, if you could put it, law, so that he can take advantage of another man's wife. And so this is a peculiar if you want to put it, a foreshadowing to what is going to take place and how David is going to change and develop as a character, and this is going to end up becoming one of his shortcomings, the way in which he is going to fall as a king. And the next thing that we can just highlight is after he is given the bread to be able to eat, what is interesting is that he asks then Ahimalek for a weapon. Now this is peculiar because he comes to the priest to ask for a weapon, and he says in verse 8, David asked Ahimelech, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent. Now, the first thing that's quite interesting about this is the last time we hear about a spear was when when Jonathan was nearly being pinned against the wall by his own father Saul, as Saul sat with a spear in hand, and David himself has come into near close contact with a spear. So it's just interesting to pick up that here David asks, do you have a spear or a sword? David asks either for the weapon of Saul, or he asks for another weapon, and the other weapon that is brought to our attention, we find in verse 9. Listen to what it says. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. And so it almost creates a little bit of this tension between the possibility that David could take up a spear and become in some ways like Saul, or he could take up the sword. And in many ways, we are reminded, as well as someone else is reminded, that David has conquered Goliath. He is a mighty warrior. He is a strong warrior who is capable of being victorious over an enemy. He is a good king who is able to bring victory for his people. Something else, though, that needs to be highlighted is wrapped up in this first section. There is the snake in the grass, and that snake in the grass is none other than Doeg. And so we need to just take a look and see what is transpiring with this character. So if you want to look there with me, we will turn to it. Verse 7, this is all that we are told, but he is there. Now, one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. Now, this is important for us to keep in mind because Doeg is going to come back into the picture, and in a very profound way in the next chapter. And this is really an introduction to him, but it's also an introduction to Ahimalek. So we have Ahimalek and Doeg that are pitted against one another at this point, and this is the introduction to what is going to transpire. And so I'm not going to say much more on that, but be aware, there is a snake in the midst who is going to inform on what has been transpiring here at Nob. And as a result, there are going to be massive ramifications of what takes place. The next section is David has now, from Nob, he has acquired the sword of Goliath. He has eaten this consecrated bread. And so we have this figure of not only a kingly figure, as we are reminded that he has conquered Goliath, and he takes up Goliath's sword, but he is also in many ways subtly seen as a priestly figure as he takes the bread, the consecrated bread. And rather than reading too much into it, just be aware that this is a unique, in one way, a unique suggestion to this kingly role that David, or at least the Messiah, will take on, is both a priestly role as well as a kingly role. And then something peculiar happens to the progression of the story. Off he goes to Gath. For what reason, we aren't exactly sure why he heads that way. We know that he's fleeing from Saul, but why he heads to Gath and particularly ends up before the king of Gath, we aren't sure. And so he goes off, and he is in the presence of the king of Gath. And as the story unfolds, we find that they recognize, or at least the people around the king's servants, recognize who David is. And they say, this is the man who they sing about. They say Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And what what happens is David is filled with fear when he hears it, when it takes root in his heart. He hears the phrase, and suddenly he's instilled with fear. This man with the very sword of the Philistine enemy, he is now in the Philistine territory, holding on to the sword of Gath, and his realization is that either they are going to see him as a threat, as a king. They refer to David even as a king, and so as a result they will kill him. And so David acts quickly, and he pretends to be mad, and as a result this Philistine king doesn't want him in his presence, and so he is cast out. His life is spared because of his faked insanity. And so for some reason this works. Instead of holding on to him, realizing who he is, and recognizing that, well, if this is really the king of Judah, or the king of Israel, at least at this point, that he is a threat, so we must kill him. But instead he is sent away and disregarded. And as a result, David then moves into Edolam. And this is interesting if you have to plot it. The course. He goes from Nob to Gath, and then almost seems to track halfway back to Nob, where he goes and hides in Edolam, in a cave there. And it's at this point that in his hiding, his family hears about him. So here David has to flee from his own nation. He flees from the enemy, and so he's isolated. He has no home. He has nowhere to go. And so he goes into hiding. And it's at this point that his family hear about him. And not only his family, but those that are desperate for a king that is just and fair, that need help and protection. And they come to him. And what does David do? He doesn't chase them away. He doesn't take from them even further, as perhaps a king would be expected to do. But instead he takes them to another king. He takes them to the king of Moab, and he asked the king of Moab to look after them, and so he makes an agreement, and so his family and all those that are in need of protection go to Moab and are looked after there. And then David goes back into hiding until the prophet tells him, the prophet Gad tells him that he needs to go back to Judah. And this is significant because what we are told is that David is waiting. He is waiting to hear what he needs to do next. And so listen just to these words as we look at that. In verse 3 it says, "From there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, 'Would you let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do with me?'" David is waiting to hear what the Lord wants to do with him next. And so through the prophet Gad, the Lord speaks and says, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Go into the land of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth, and he is on his way now to Judah. And so this is phenomenal, just seeing this progression of the story of 1 Samuel, but also the development of this person of David. David is cunning. He is calculated. He does things that seem peculiar on the surface, but it is according to what seems to be waiting on the Lord's timing of things. And so as he flees from Saul, he is not yet the king. He has not yet been appointed as the king or the Messiah for Israel, but instead he flees, he runs. And until that time comes, supposedly he needs to continue to hide and flee and do what he needs to do in order to survive. He arrives at Nob and he asks for bread, he asks for a weapon, and what he does is he's able to eat of the consecrated bread. He takes up a weapon that is in many ways a mark of his kingship as a warrior king. And not only that, but even when he is in hiding, those that are in desperate need come to him and he is able to protect and provide. And perhaps you wonder, but what do you make of this insanity that he acts out before the king of Gath? Well, again, perhaps it was at that point the most cunning and craftiest thing he could do for his own survival, but ultimately to wait, to be patient, and to ensure that he will eventually go to where he needs to be and take up the role of king over Israel. But it is interesting that he does wait on the Lord. He seems to be waiting to see what needs to take place next. And so we hear at the end of this section that he needs to go back to Judah because something new is going to transpire. And so this is phenomenal for us, looking at this passage this morning and really asking, well, what's the significance for us today? What do I make of a passage like this? It's complex. It almost doesn't make any sense because why do I need to even know this? Why do I need to know what a passage like this is all about? Well, on one side, David paints for us not a picture of what we can measure up to. And in particular, you don't necessarily want to measure up to David in a passage like this. And that's the point. We're not supposed to try and measure up to David. But David does seem to be doing things in a very meticulous and calculated way. He seems to be doing things as things transpire, as things unfold. But as he does it, he fills certain roles and certain things that we see in someone else. So as we look to David, we see someone that is able to conspire, but not for his own sake, but actually a greater sake. He has been anointed as king. He has not yet been made king, but he has been anointed by the Lord as king. And so what we are going to see is that as he is also anointed, he's going to take up that role in time. But he's not going to take up that role outside of what God's plan is. And so this passage, as peculiar as it is, as he arrives at Nob, as he seeks the help and conspires with Ahimalek, and that will tie in with next week when we look at what happens with Ahimalek, that there seems to be something transpiring and conspiring taking place there. And as that unfolds, we see that this is all for the plan and purpose of David being appointed as king and taking up that role in his right time, but also that he has at times little glimpses of things that are priestly in nature and prophetic in nature. And so when we look at David, we catch a glimpse of his role that he is stepping into. We also catch a glimpse of how he is going to fail. There are little suggestions, little ideas that perhaps David is willing to compromise, that he is willing to lie about things, or that he is willing to bend certain rules in order for his own benefit. But there is a Messiah, there is the Messiah, who never failed, who didn't succumb to those temptations. What is so phenomenal is when we look at Jesus, we see how he bends those rules, those conditions, those things that we would expect you should follow. And he seems to show us that he is far greater than what we ever thought. And so we need to just turn to the New Testament, where we find at least a reference to this passage this morning. And listen to these words in Matthew 12. It says, "At the time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.' He answered, 'Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." And so this is phenomenal for us to look at this today and to use this as an anchor point to draw it all together. That here David seems to do strange things, but for a sake that isn't linear, it's not human, it's not necessarily something that we will always understand here and now in the way we look at things, the way we understand things. When we look at David's actions going from Nob to Gath to Edom to Moab, there's this progression of peculiarity and almost it doesn't fit what we would think it should fit and how it should work together. But here we see that, well, Jesus says something incredible. He says, David, he ate consecrated bread, which was unlawful. But it is not about what you think is right or wrong or that needs to fit a system. He says, ultimately what Jesus is saying is that you are looking at a system and not a person. And as we look at David, we see this progression that it's not about the system. It's not about the world that they live in. It is about the position, the role, the responsibility that the king has. You have David who will go to extreme measures. And we see that the last thing that he does in this passage is to protect and look after people, family, friends, those that are desperate and in need. And this seems to be the right kind of role for a king to fulfill. And then we turn to Jesus and we see him in this passage in Matthew 12. And he does just that. He enters the synagogue. He enters into the synagogue where a man has this deformed hand. And Jesus says, "Let me heal you." And he heals him on the Sabbath. And it's because, as he says in verse 8, "For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Jesus Christ, the true Messiah, the true King, the true Savior, the true protector, he came at the right time according to God's plan. And he died. He suffered. It's interesting that the correlation between this, what Jesus says here, and what was transpiring with David, even more so. Listen to these words toward the end, verse 13. "Then he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus." You have this incredible passage where you have the snake in the grass. You have Doeg, who is watching at the temple. He is watching and waiting to see what happens with David. And David breaks the rules. David breaks the system. And Doeg goes off and he plots and he schemes with Saul to get rid of David. And they will go to any measure to eradicate this king, this Messiah figure. And it's not any different to what they have done to Jesus Christ, what we have done to Jesus Christ. Here we see that Jesus Christ is the one who we look to. He is the Son, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who is King. He is the one who is Lord. He is the one who is priest and prophet. He is the one that fulfills all things. So when we look at David in a passage like this morning, we see that David is going to fail, and it alludes to that. But Jesus Christ never did. Jesus Christ succeeded. He rose again. He was victorious. He is victorious. And for us today, we celebrate in the perfect timing, the perfect planning of how Jesus Christ did what he did. And how today we celebrate and rejoice and are thankful in that. That we have a King that wasn't overcome. Though they hung him on a cross, he rose again. And for that, we are incredibly grateful and we rejoice. And as he fled and moved and shifted, as he was chased out of societies, out of communities, out of cities, that he didn't have a place to rest his head, we find that through him we ultimately have a place. And that place is with him. That he is preparing a home for us. May that be a reminder this morning that the story of David and all of his movements and all of the things that transpire, we see it all the more through Jesus Christ and how incredible Jesus Christ fulfills it for us. But it is all for an ultimate purpose. David was going ultimately to establish God's kingship. That was the intention. And even he failed. But Jesus does it perfectly. Jesus installs and perfects that kingship. Let's pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this passage this morning. As peculiar as it is and has so many different aspects there are to it, we look to David, but ultimately we do see Jesus Christ who was far better. But as complicated as David's mission was, as his life unfolded and as he was hunted down by Saul, we look to Jesus, who was hunted down by the very system, the very religious world around him, that was so caught up on the religion of it that they failed to see the person, the Son of Man, who is Lord of the Sabbath. And for us today, may we recognize that Jesus Christ is not a religious figure. He is a figure of adoption for us. He invites us in. He calls us home. He prepares a way for us. And that he has done so as prophet, priest, and king. That he is our true Messiah. He is the Savior of all those that call on his name. So gracious Father, we thank you. We thank you for Jesus Christ. We thank you that your wisdom and your plans surpass anything that we can even conspire and think about. And we thank you for Jesus Christ. We pray this in his name. Amen. Well, I hope that this is an interesting passage for you, but also a challenging one, and that it gets you to wrestle and think a little bit more deeply about who David is, but ultimately who he is preparing us for, and that is Jesus Christ. Have a great day, and we'll see you all next week. Cheers, bye.